The horse was already running before Julian Hale decided to let it. He had left the house without telling anyone, without a coat, without a plan, because if he stayed inside those walls one more hour, he was going to say something to his uncle that could not be taken back. The wedding contract sat on the desk in the study, waiting for his signature, waiting to turn his whole life into a line item on someone else's ledger. He was the Duke of Ashcombe now, whether he wanted the title or not, and a duke did not get to choose his own mourning, let alone his own wife. So he rode. The fields blurred gray and gold around him, the sky still holding onto the last of the night, and he did not slow down until the ground dropped toward the river, and the horse, more sensible than its rider, refused to go any faster near the bank. Julian pulled up hard. His heart was going faster than the ride should have made it go. He sat there, breathing, waiting for his head to catch up with the rest of him. That was when he heard the splash. Not a large one. A small, sharp sound, like someone had thrown something into the water and immediately regretted it. He turned the horse toward the noise and saw her. A young woman stood knee-deep in the river, skirts bunched and tied at her hip, sleeves pushed past her elbows, both arms deep in the current as she wrestled a soaked bundle of linen back into her grip. She had lost her footing on a stone and gone half down, and now she was laughing at herself, alone, with no one around to see it, the sound rising up over the water like she had forgotten the whole world was supposed to be asleep. Julian did not move. He did not want to move. He had never in his life seen anyone look that free. She caught sight of him a moment later and went still, the laugh dying fast, replaced by the wary look of someone who has just realized she is not as alone as she thought. She was still holding the linen like a shield. "You gave me a fright," she said, straightening up, water running off her arms. "Do you always creep up on people at this hour?" "I didn't creep," Julian said. "You were the one making noise." "I fell in a river. Forgive me for not doing it quietly." He almost smiled. He could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that, without measuring the words first, without checking his face to see how much they were allowed to say. He swung down off the horse before he had decided to, and led it closer to the bank. "You should get out of the water," he said. "It's early, you'll catch a chill." "I've caught worse than a chill washing linens before sunrise," she said, wringing out the cloth in her hands with practiced, brisk movements. "This is my work, not my leisure. Some of us don't get to choose when the day starts." There was no bitterness in it, only fact, the kind of fact that told him more about her life than a full conversation would have. He watched her climb out onto the bank, bare feet finding the flat stones with the ease of long habit, and something in his chest tightened in a way he did not have a name for yet. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Elena," she said. "Elena Marsh." "Julian," he said, and left it there. No title. No mention of the house on the hill behind them, the house with more rooms than the whole village had people. In that moment he did not want to be a duke. He wanted to be a man standing by a river talking to a woman who had just fallen in and laughed about it. "You're not from around here," Elena said, studying him properly now, taking in the fine cut of his shirt even though it was plain, the way he held the horse's reins like he had never had to think about how to hold them. "Are you staying at the manor?" "Something like that," Julian said. She raised an eyebrow but did not push. She had linens to finish and the sun was already starting to climb, turning the mist on the water a soft gold. She knelt back down at the edge, dipping the cloth in again, and Julian found himself crouching down nearby, not offering to help exactly, because he suspected she would refuse it, but not leaving either. "You don't have to stay," she said, not looking up. "I know. Most men who talk to me before sunrise want something." "I don't want anything," Julian said, and it was true, except that it was also the first lie of the morning, because already he wanted to know what she sounded like when she was not being careful, what she looked like in full daylight, whether she would still speak to him the same way if she knew his name came with a title attached to it. They talked while she worked, small things, the weather, the state of the roads after the last rain. She asked him nothing about his family and he offered nothing, and it felt, for the length of that conversation, like the two of them existed outside of every rule that governed the rest of his life. She had a sharp tongue and a quick laugh, and she did not flinch when he teased her back. He had forgotten what that felt like, being teased by someone who was not trying to win his favor. A church bell rang somewhere in the distance, far off but clear, marking the hour. Elena's head came up fast. "I have to go," she said, gathering the last of the linens into her arms in one practiced motion. "My sister will wonder where I've gone." "Will I see you again?" Julian asked, and he heard how it sounded even as he said it, too eager, too much like a man who had no business asking. Elena paused at the top of the bank, looking back at him with an expression he could not quite read. Amused, careful, a little something else underneath both of those. "You know where the river is," she said. "I wash here most mornings. If you happen to be creeping about again, I suppose I can't stop you." Then she was gone, up the path and through the trees, and Julian stood there by the water with his horse and the slow gold light, and a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest that had nothing to do with escaping the house, and everything to do with a woman who did not know his name came with a crown of expectation stitched into it. He rode back slower than he had ridden out. The house was awake by the time he returned, servants moving through the halls with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned not to ask a duke where he had been. His uncle, Edmund Price, was waiting in the study, the marriage contract still spread across the desk, ink and seal ready, only his signature missing. "You've been out," Edmund said. "It was not a question." "I needed air." "You need a wife," Edmund said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man who had spent years managing an estate that could not survive on air alone. "Lady Constance Ward arrives within the month. Her family's terms are more than fair. This house needs her fortune as much as it needs an heir, and you know it." Julian looked at the contract. He thought of numbers on a page, of a marriage that would be discussed in rooms he was not present for, negotiated like the sale of land. Then, without meaning to, he thought of a laugh rising over a river at dawn, unguarded and real, and the two images sat so far apart in his mind that he almost laughed himself, though there was nothing funny about it. "I'll sign it," Julian said, "when the time comes." "The time is coming quickly," Edmund said. Julian said nothing. He walked to the window instead and looked out toward the low line of trees that hid the river from view, and he thought about gold light on water, and a name that had come to him without a title attached, and he understood with a clarity that unsettled him, that something in his careful, contracted life had already begun to crack. He did not go back to the river the next morning. He told himself it was because of the contract, because of his uncle's patience running thin, because a duke did not have the luxury of chasing a feeling down to a riverbank before breakfast. He told himself several reasons, and none of them held. On the third morning, he went anyway. She was there again, sleeves pushed up, hands moving through the cold water with the same brisk rhythm as before. She heard the horse this time and did not startle, only glanced over her shoulder with something that might have been relief and might have been satisfaction at being right about him. "I wondered if you'd come back," Elena said. "I wondered the same thing," Julian admitted, and swung down from the horse, and told himself, as he crossed the last stretch of grass toward the water, that this would be the only morning, that after today he would go back to the house and sign the contract and let the rest of his life proceed as it was meant to. He did not believe himself even as he thought it. The sun climbed higher over the water, turning the mist to gold, and somewhere behind him, back at the house on the hill, a marriage contract sat waiting for a signature that would decide the whole shape of his future. But here, by the river, none of that existed yet. Here there was only Elena Marsh, laughing at something he'd said, and the strange, dangerous feeling that he had found something he was not supposed to want. The fair came to Ashcombe village on the last warm Saturday before the harvest, And Alina Marsh had exactly 4 coins in her pocket and a promise to her sister that she would not spend a single one of them on anything foolish. She broke that promise within the hour, buying a ribbon the color of a robin's egg because Mabel had pointed at it 3 times and pretended she hadn't. The two of them wove through the crowded green, past stalls of cider and roasted nuts, and a man selling carved wooden birds that whistled when you blew through their tails. And for a little while Alina let herself forget the ledger at home, the rent that was due, the field that had flooded and ruined half the season's grain. Then the crowd shifted, and she saw him. He was standing near the front of the green, dressed the way she had never seen him dressed, dark coat cut sharp across the shoulders, boots polished to a shine that had never touched a riverbank. People bowed to him, not nodded, bowed. An older man beside him spoke into his ear, and he answered with a short, distant word, the kind of word a man uses when he is being watched by an entire village and knows it. Alina's stomach dropped so fast she thought she might be sick right there on the green. "Alina," Mabel's hand was on her arm. "Alina, what's wrong? You've gone the color of that ribbon." "Who is that?" Alina said, though she already knew. Everyone knew. She had simply refused for 3 mornings running to put the pieces together, because the man by the river had introduced himself with one plain word and no title, and she had let herself believe, foolishly, wonderfully, that it meant something. "That's the Duke," Mabel said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, because to everyone but Alina it was. "Duke of Ashcombe. Just came into the title last year when his father passed. Why do you know him?" Alina did not answer. She was too busy remembering every word she had said to him by the river, every joke, every complaint about wet linen and early mornings, every time she had teased him for creeping about like he had nothing better to do. He had let her say all of it. He had stood there in his plain shirt and let her believe he was nobody, and the whole time he had been the man half the village was bowing to. "I have to go," Alina said, and turned before Mabel could ask why, weaving back through the crowd with her face burning, the ribbon crushed forgotten in her fist. She did not get far. A hand caught her elbow, gentle but sure, and she spun around already angry, already prepared, and found Julian standing there, out of breath like he had pushed through the whole green to reach her. "You could have told me," Alina said, before he could speak first. 3 mornings. 3 mornings I stood there talking to you like you were some ordinary man out for a ride, and the whole time you were laughing at me." "I wasn't laughing at you." His voice was low, urgent, aware of how many eyes were nearby even if none of them could hear the words. "Alina, I swear to you I wasn't laughing." "Then what were you doing?" "Amusing yourself. Seeing how a farmer's daughter behaves when she doesn't know she's talking to a duke." The words came out sharper than she meant them, but she could not stop them now that they had started. Her mother's name rose up unbidden in her mind, the old shame the whole village still whispered about when they thought Alina couldn't hear, a woman who had trusted a man above her station and paid for it with her reputation and eventually her life. Alina had promised herself, a long time ago, that she would never be that foolish. "I didn't tell you because for the first time since my father died, someone was speaking to me like a person and not like a title," Julian said. "I didn't want to lose that. I still don't." "You don't get to want that," Alina said, quieter now but no less firm. "You're a duke. I wash linen for a living. Whatever this was, it was a mistake and it's finished." She pulled her arm free and walked away, and this time Julian did not follow, though it cost him something to stand still and let her go. Around them the fair carried on, oblivious, music rising from a fiddle somewhere near the cider stall, children shrieking with laughter as they chased a loose dog between the stalls. None of it touched him. He stood there in his fine coat, surrounded by people who bowed to him, and felt more alone than he had in the 3 mornings he'd spent by the river with a woman who hadn't known enough to be careful around him. That evening, back at the house, the second blow of the day arrived in a carriage. Lady Constance Ward was not what Julian had expected, though he could not have said what he had expected instead. She was composed in a way that seemed to come naturally rather than through effort, dressed with quiet precision, and she greeted him with a handshake instead of a curtsy, which surprised him enough that he nearly forgot to respond. "I understand this arrangement is as much a business matter as anything else," Constance said, once they were seated in the drawing room, her father and Edmund Price conferring quietly by the window over the details of dowries and land. "I would rather we speak plainly to each other, if you don't mind. It will save us both a great deal of pretending." "I don't mind," Julian said, and found that he meant it. There was something almost restful about her directness, a woman who did not ask him to perform affection he did not feel, who seemed, if anything, equally unmoved by the whole affair. "Good," Constance said. "Then you should know I have no illusions about romance in this. My family needs the connection your title provides. Yours needs the funds mine can offer. I am told that is enough for most marriages of our kind to succeed." "Is it enough for you?" Julian asked. Constance considered the question longer than he expected. "It will have to be," she said finally. "I don't see that either of us has much choice in the matter." He should have felt relief at her honesty. Instead, he felt the conversation settle over him like a weight, because as plainly as Constance spoke, as reasonable as every word of it was, none of it moved anything in his chest the way 3 mornings by a river had moved it, and he understood with a dull, resigned kind of clarity exactly how much trouble he had already gotten himself into. The trouble found Alina 2 days later, and it did not come gently. Edmund Price arrived at the Marsh farm himself, which never happened, which meant whatever business he had was serious enough that he did not trust it to a lesser man. Alina's father met him at the gate, hat in hand, the careful deference of a man who had spent his whole life understanding exactly how little power he held. "The rent is short," Edmund said, without preamble. "Has been short 3 seasons running since the flood took your east field. I've carried you as long as I reasonably can, but with the estate's expenses what they are, and a wedding to prepare for, I cannot keep carrying tenants who don't pay." "We'll have it," Alina's father said. "By winter we'll have it, I swear on my wife's grave." "Winter is a long way off," Edmund said, not unkindly but without softening either. "I'll give you until the end of the month. After that, I'll have no choice but to let the land to someone who can pay for it." He left before Alina, who had been standing in the doorway listening to the whole exchange with her hands gone cold, could say a single word in protest. Her father sat down heavily on the step, the weight of it settling over his shoulders in a way that made him look older than she had ever seen him look. "We'll manage," Alina said, though she did not know how, and her father did not answer because he did not know either. She thought briefly, cruelly, of the man by the river, of how easily he could have solved this entire problem with a single word to his steward, and how she would never in 100 years bring herself to ask him for it. Pride was the one thing she had that no flood and no ledger could take from her, and she was not about to hand it over to a duke, not even one who had made her laugh before sunrise, not even one whose voice she still heard sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep. She went to the river the next morning anyway. She told herself it was for the linens. She knew, even as she said it to herself, that it was a lie. Julian was already there when she arrived, standing by the water with his horse cropping grass nearby. And something about the set of his shoulders told her he had been waiting a long while. "I heard about the rent," he said before she could speak. "Edmund shouldn't have gone to your father like that. I'll speak to him." "Don't," Alina said, sharper than she meant to. "I don't want your charity. I don't want anything from you that comes because of what you are, do you understand? If you help my family because you feel guilty over a conversation by a river, it will only prove I was right to walk away from you at the fair." "Then let me ask you something else," Julian said. "Not as a duke. As Julian, the man you met 3 mornings running before you knew any better. Would you have kept talking to me if I had told you the truth from the start?" Alina opened her mouth to answer and found, to her own frustration, that she did not have one ready. The honest answer sat somewhere she did not want to look at too closely, tangled up with everything she had been taught about men above her station, and the mother whose mistakes still followed her through the village like a shadow she had never earned. "It doesn't matter," she said instead. "It's finished. Whatever this was, it's finished, and you're getting married, and I have a family to keep fed, and none of that leaves any room for whatever you think is happening between us." She turned to go, and this time it was her own feet that felt heavy on the path, her own chest that ached in a way she refused to name. Behind her, Julian did not call out. He only stood by the water, watching her walk away for the second time in a week, and he thought with a kind of grim certainty that a signed contract and an entire village of expectation were not going to be enough to make him forget the sound of her laugh. Somewhere behind them both, unseen, unspoken, the month Edmund Price had given the Marsh family was already counting down. The fire started in the middle of the night, and it was Elena who smelled the smoke first. She woke coughing, her throat raw before her mind had even caught up to what was wrong, and by the time she threw herself out of bed, the whole downstairs of the farmhouse was glowing orange through the gaps in the floorboards. She screamed for Mabel, for her father, and the three of them stumbled out into the yard in whatever they had been wearing to sleep, barefoot on cold ground, watching helplessly as the home they had lived in for 20 years began to come apart in flame and smoke. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the lane. Someone was shouting for buckets. Elena stood frozen for one terrible moment, watching sparks lift into the black sky like something almost beautiful, before her father's hand closed hard around her arm and pulled her back from the heat. "The animals," he said hoarse, "the animals are still in the barn." The barn stood 20 feet from the house, close enough that if the wind shifted even slightly, it would catch too. Elena did not think. She ran. She got the goats out first, and the chickens scattered on their own, shrieking into the dark, and she was reaching for the rope on the old mare's stall when a beam somewhere above her groaned and dropped a shower of burning straw across the entrance behind her. The heat hit her like a wall. Smoke poured in thick and fast, and for the first time in her life Elena understood, with total clarity, that she might not walk out of a building she had walked into 1,000 times before. She did not walk out, she was carried out. She did not know, in the moment, whose arms had closed around her, only that she was suddenly moving through air that did not burn her lungs, and then she was on the ground outside, coughing until her whole body shook, and someone was kneeling over her, checking her face, her hands, her arms for burns with a frantic, careful urgency that told her exactly who it was before her smoke-stung eyes managed to focus. "Julian," she rasped. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here, you're out, you're safe." "The mare," Elena said, trying to sit up, trying to look back toward the barn where the fire had begun to climb the far wall. "Gareth's got her," Julian said, nodding toward his friend, who was leading the old horse clear of the smoke with a length of cloth pressed over his own mouth. "Everyone's out. Elena, everyone is out." She let herself believe him, finally, and the fight went out of her all at once, replaced by a shaking so complete she could not have stood up if her life depended on it. Julian did not let go of her. He sat there on the cold ground with the whole sky lit orange above them, holding her while the fire crew from the village finally arrived with their buckets and their ladders, too late to save much of the house, but in time to keep the barn from following it. By the time the sun came up, the Marsh farmhouse was a blackened shell, and Julian Hale had not left Elena's side once. He had been on his way back from a late ride, unable to sleep, thinking of her the way he had been thinking of her every night for weeks, when he had seen the glow over the trees and known, with a certainty he could not explain, exactly whose home it was. He had ridden faster than he had ever ridden in his life. He did not tell her that part. He did not need to. She had felt it in the way he had pulled her out of that barn, like the whole world would end if he did not. "You could have been killed," he said, now quiet, once the worst of the smoke had cleared and her father and Mabel were being tended by neighbors nearby. His hands were still shaking slightly, though he was trying to hide it. "Running in there for an animal. You could have died in that fire, Alina." "It was my home," Alina said. "It was everything my family had left." "It was a barn," Julian said, and then softer, "It wasn't worth your life." She looked at him properly then, soot-streaked and hollow-eyed in the gray morning light, and something in his face was not the careful composure of a duke managing a difficult situation. It was raw. It was afraid. It was the face of a man who had spent the whole ride over there certain he was about to lose something he had never even let himself claim. "Why were you even out riding at this hour?" she said, though she thought she already knew. "Because I can't sleep," Julian said. "Because for weeks now every time I close my eyes I hear you laughing at me on that riverbank, and I think about how I let you walk away from me twice, and I hate myself a little more each time I remember it." Alina's chest tightened, and she did not have the strength left, after the night she had just survived, to keep pretending she felt nothing in return. "You're getting married," she said, but it came out without the sharp edge it had carried at the river, worn thin by exhaustion and smoke, and the simple, undeniable fact that he had run into a burning night for her. "I haven't signed anything yet," Julian said. "You will." "I don't know that anymore." He said it low, almost to himself, like a confession he had not planned on making. Around them the village continued its work, hauling water, comforting her father, the ordinary business of disaster recovery moving forward without either of them, and in the middle of it Julian reached out and very gently brushed a streak of soot from her cheek, his hand lingering a moment longer than the task required. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing left to say that the moment hadn't already said for them. The Marsh family moved into a small cottage on the edge of the estate that same week, a property that had stood empty since the last tenant passed, and if the arrangement came with no mention of rent for the first several months, Alina chose, for once, not to ask too many questions about why. She had learned something in the fire that pride alone could not undo. That some kindnesses were not charity, they were simply what people did for people they could not stand to watch suffer, and she was tired, finally, of punishing Julian for the accident of his birth. They began meeting again, not only at the river, but in the quiet corners of the estate where no one thought to look for a duke, the old orchard, the ruined chapel at the edge of the woods, a bench overlooking the valley where Julian had gone as a boy whenever his father's temper had made the house unbearable. He told her things there he had never told anyone. About his father, who had loved the estate more than he had ever managed to love his son. About the loneliness of a title that filled a room with people and left him feeling, more often than not, entirely alone in it. Alina told him things too. About her mother, whose name still could not be spoken in the village without someone lowering their voice, a woman who had loved a man above her station and paid for it with her name, and eventually with her life in childbirth, leaving Alina with a lesson she had spent years trying to live by and had somehow, impossibly, broken anyway. "I'm not him," Julian said when she told him this, understanding at last why she had fought so hard against whatever was growing between them. "Whoever hurt your mother, I'm not him, Alina." "I know that," Alina said. "I think I've known it since the first morning, if I'm honest. It didn't make it any less frightening." "Is it still frightening?" She considered the question with the same seriousness she gave everything, weighing it against the ashes of her old home and the ring finger of a woman named Constance Ward who was, even now, choosing fabric for a wedding gown in a house not far from where they sat. "Yes," Alina said, "but I'm tired of letting fear make my choices for me." It was as close to an admission as either of them had allowed themselves, and Julian did not push for more. He simply reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and for a long while they sat in the fading light above the valley, saying nothing at all, while somewhere behind them a wedding date drew closer with every quiet, borrowed hour they spent together. Gareth found Julian alone that night in the stables, brushing down his horse with more force than the task required, working off some tension he had not managed to name out loud. You're playing with fire, Gareth said, leaning against the stall door. And I don't mean the one at the Marsh place. I know what I'm doing, Julian said. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you've got a wedding to Lady Constance Ward in 6 weeks, a signed agreement between two families that both need this marriage to survive, and you're spending every free hour of your day with a woman who is, by her own account, terrified of exactly the kind of man you are. She's not terrified of me. She's terrified of what happened to her mother, Gareth said. And you're standing close enough to that history that you'd better be certain, Julian, dead certain, before you let this go any further. Because if you break that woman's heart the way your father broke half the hearts in this county, you won't just be losing a chance at happiness. You'll be proving her right about every fear she's ever had. Julian set down the brush. The horse shifted, unbothered in the quiet of the stable, and outside the last light was fading fast over the fields that separated his house from the cottage where Alina now slept, safe, alive, close enough to reach and impossibly far away all at once. I'll fix it, Julian said, though he did not yet know how, only that the wedding contract on his desk had begun to feel less like a formality and more like a wall he was going to have to find some way to tear down, whatever it cost him, before it closed around him for the rest of his life. Gareth said nothing more. He only nodded once and left Julian alone with the horse and the dark and the growing certainty that the next few weeks were going to demand a choice he could not keep putting off. Constance Ward was not a fool, and she had never pretended to be one. She noticed it in small things at first. The way Julian's attention drifted during dinner when his uncle mentioned estate business near the eastern cottages. The way he returned from his morning rides with a particular quiet about him, not tired, but distant, like a man carrying something he had not set down yet. She noticed the way the housekeeper's niece, who worked in the kitchens, had mentioned once, carelessly, seeing the Duke walking near the old chapel with a young woman from the tenant cottages, and how the comment had been dropped so quickly afterward that Constance understood it had been meant to be forgotten. She said nothing for a long while. She had entered this arrangement with her eyes open, had told Julian herself, on the very first evening, that she expected no romance from it. But there was a difference between expecting no romance and watching, day by day, the particular way a man's face changed when a name was mentioned in passing, and Constance found that the difference mattered more to her than she had planned for. She confronted him 3 weeks before the wedding, in the same drawing room where they had first spoken plainly to each other. "I would like the truth," Constance said, seated with her hands folded, composed as ever, though something beneath the composure had gone brittle. "Is there someone else, Julian?" He did not lie to her. He owed her that much, whatever else he owed her. "Yes," he said, "there is." Constance absorbed this with a long, steady breath. "The tenant's daughter, Alina Marsh." "You know about her." "Servants talk, and I am not blind," Constance said. "I have watched you for weeks, wondering if I was imagining it. I am relieved in a strange way to know I was not. Constance, I never meant for this to happen while we were." "Don't," she said, holding up a hand, not unkindly but firmly enough to stop him. "I don't need an apology for falling in love, Julian, even inconveniently. What I need is honesty about what happens now, because I did not agree to spend my life as the second choice of a man who is only marrying me because it is easier than telling the truth." The word landed harder than she had perhaps intended it to, and Julian sat with it a long moment, because it was, in every uncomfortable way, exactly true. He had let this contract carry him forward because breaking it meant disappointing his uncle, disrupting an estate that depended on Constance's fortune, unraveling a plan that had been years in the making before he had ever met her or Alina, either one. It had been easier to let the machinery of the arrangement keep turning than to stop it and face what stopping it would cost. "I don't want to hurt you," Julian said. "That was never my intention." "I know," Constance said. But intention and outcome are different things, and I would rather face the outcome honestly than pretend, for both our sakes, that a marriage built on your divided heart could ever be a kindness to either of us." She left the room with her composure fully restored, and Julian sat alone with the weight of what she had said settling over him like a verdict. He understood, with sudden and total clarity, that he had been a coward for weeks, letting two women carry the consequences of a choice that was entirely his to make and entirely his that he had kept putting off. He went to find Alina that same evening, determined finally to say the thing he had been circling for months, only to find the cottage dark and Mabel waiting on the step, arms crossed, her face carrying none of her usual warmth. "She's not here," Mabel said. "Where is she?" "Gone to think," Mabel said. "She heard about your Lady Constance's visit to the tenant cottages this morning. Word travels fast in a place this small, your grace." Julian's stomach dropped. "What visit?" "Ask your betrothed," Mabel said, and went back inside, leaving Julian standing in the dark with a cold, sinking understanding that whatever had happened, it had happened without him, and it had already done its damage. He found the truth of it faster than he expected. Constance, it turned out, had gone to the cottage herself that afternoon, before her conversation with Julian in the drawing room, driven by a need to see for herself the woman who had quietly, unknowingly, taken up residence in her betrothed's heart. She had not gone to threaten. She had gone, in her own composed and deliberate way, to understand, and what she had told Alina in that brief, careful conversation had been the truth as she understood it. That Julian was set to marry her within the month, that the contract between their families had been signed by both fathers years in advance of any wedding date, and that whatever Alina believed was growing between herself and the Duke would end, one way or another, the day the vows were spoken. Alina had thanked her, quietly, for her honesty, and had not cried until Constance's carriage was well out of sight. Julian found her at the river at dusk, the same stretch of water where all of it had started, and she did not turn when she heard his horse, only stood very still with her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. "Constance told me everything," Alina said before he could speak. "The contract, the date, all of it months in the making, long before either of us ever stood here talking about nothing important." "Alina." "I let myself believe you," she said, and her voice cracked on the word, though she did not let it break further. "After the fire, after everything you said above the valley, about not being the man who hurt my mother, about fear not making my choices for me, I let myself believe there was a way through this, and the whole time there was a wedding date sitting on a calendar somewhere, waiting. I was going to end it." Julian said, "Tonight I came to tell you I was going to end it." "But you hadn't yet," Alina said. "You let me find out from her, standing in my own doorway, being told by the woman you're about to marry that whatever I felt for you was already finished before it began." He reached for her and she stepped back, not far but far enough, and the small distance between them felt, in that moment, wider than the whole river. "I won't be your secret," Alina said, quiet now, all the anger burned down into something steadier and far harder to argue with. "I watched what that did to my mother. A man who wanted her in the dark and a wife who got him in the daylight, and I swore I would never be the woman standing in someone else's shadow, waiting for a choice that might never come. I love you, Julian. I think I have since that very first morning. But I would rather love you and let you go than spend my life waiting to see if you'll ever choose me out loud." "I am choosing you," Julian said, desperate now, hearing how close he was to losing something he had only just found the courage to want fully. "I told Constance the truth today. I am ending the contract, whatever it costs the estate, whatever my uncle says." "Then finish it," Alina said. "Finish it all the way without me standing here waiting to see if you will. Because if you come back to me still half tied to another life, I will know it, Julian, and I won't be able to trust a single word of what's left." She walked away from him for the third time, and this time he let her go, not because he wanted to, but because he understood finally that she was right. He had spent months letting the momentum of other people's plans carry him forward, and the only way to prove to her, and to himself, that he had truly chosen was to walk back into that house and undo the whole arrangement completely, cleanly, without half measures, before he asked her to trust him with anything at all. He rode back to the house in the full dark, the contract waiting on the desk exactly where it had waited for months, and for the first time since his father's death, Julian Hale understood exactly what he wanted his life to look like, and exactly what it was going to cost him to have it. His uncle was waiting in the study when he arrived. The candles burned low, the estate's account book stacked beside the contract like a silent argument already prepared. "I won't sign it," Julian said, before Edmund could speak. "I'm ending the arrangement with the Wards. Whatever debt this estate carries, we will find another way to answer it, but I will not marry a woman I do not love to solve a problem that isn't hers to fix." Edmund's face went through several expressions before settling on something tired and resigned. "Your father would never have allowed this." "My father is not standing in this room," Julian said. "I am, and I am telling you, Uncle, once and clearly that this contract ends tonight." The silence that followed held the whole weight of the estate's future in it, unresolved, uncertain, and entirely, finally, Julian's own to carry. The estate did not fall apart the way Edmund Price had warned it might, though the weeks that followed were harder than Julian had let himself imagine. Breaking the contract with the Ward family cost him exactly what his uncle had promised it would. There were debts the marriage settlement would have cleared that now sat unresolved, land disputes with a neighboring family that had been quietly settled through the promise of the union, and were now, without it, active again, and a wave of talk that moved through the county faster than any carriage could outrun it. A duke who had broken a signed agreement so close to the wedding date was a scandal by any measure, and scandal, Julian learned quickly, did not care whether the reasons behind it were honorable. Constance, to her credit, bore the gossip with more grace than Julian felt he deserved from her. She had released him from the arrangement without bitterness, had told her own family plainly that the decision had been mutual and reasoned, and had left within the month for her aunt's estate in the north, where she wrote to Julian only once, a short letter that said, in its entirety, that she hoped whatever he had chosen instead was worth the cost, because from where she stood, watching him those final weeks, it certainly seemed to be. Julian kept that letter longer than he expected to. The harder cost was Elena's absence. She had asked him to finish what he started completely and cleanly before he came back to her, and he had done exactly that. But the finishing had taken longer than either of them had planned for, tangled up in lawyers and family fury, and an uncle who did not speak to him for the better part of 2 weeks. Every day that passed without seeing her felt like a debt of its own, one he could not settle with contracts or money, only with time, and time, that autumn, moved with a stubborn slowness that tested every ounce of patience he had left. He did not go to her, not yet. She had asked him to prove his choice was whole before he asked her to trust it, and he understood that showing up at her door the moment the ink was dry on the broken contract would only prove he still measured his life in gestures and timing, rather than in the steady, unglamorous work of actually becoming a different kind of man. So he waited, and while he waited, he worked. He went personally to every tenant family whose situation Edmund had managed with cold efficiency rather than kindness, and he renegotiated terms that made sense for people who had survived floods and fires and thin harvests through no fault of their own. He restructured the estate's finances with a directness his father had never bothered with, selling off a hunting lodge in the north that the family rarely used and had only ever kept for the sake of appearances. He spent his mornings, the same early mornings he had once spent escaping his own house on horseback, walking the fields with his stewards instead, learning the land the way his father never had, understanding at last that a title was not a thing you inherited and then simply wore, but a thing you had to actually earn the right to hold. The village noticed. Slowly, the gossip about the broken engagement began to shift into something closer to respect, a grudging acknowledgement that whatever scandal the Duke had caused, he seemed determined to answer for it through action rather than apology. Alina heard about all of it in pieces, the way news traveled through a small place, carried by neighbors and market gossip and Mabel, who had taken to reporting every rumor about Julian Hale with a barely concealed satisfaction that made Alina's face go warm every time. "He's fixed the Cotter family's lease," Mabel said one evening, setting the table without looking up, the way she did when she wanted to seem casual about something that was not casual at all. "And the Price boy's been given work on the estate, proper work, paid fair, after his father died. People are saying he's turned into a different man since the wedding fell through." "He was always a different man," Alina said quietly. "I think most people just never gave him the chance to show it." "You could go see for yourself," Mabel said. "He knows where the river is," Alina said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the very words she had said to him on that first morning, and Mabel smiled the small, knowing smile of a younger sister who understood exactly what her sister would not yet say out loud. The weeks turned into 2 months, then nearly 3, autumn folding into the first cold edge of winter, and still Julian did not come to her, and still Alina did not go to him, both of them caught in a kind of patient, aching standoff that neither wanted to be the first to break, though both, in their separate quiet hours, thought of nothing else. It was Gareth, in the end, who forced the matter, arriving at the cottage on a gray December morning with a message that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with urgency. "There's flooding along the lower fields," Gareth said, breathless from riding hard. "The old dam's given way, the water's rising fast toward the tenant cottages, and Julian's out there now trying to move families clear before it reaches the lower row. He asked me to bring help. I thought of your family first, given the animals, given how well you handled the last disaster this estate threw at us." Alina did not hesitate. She grabbed her coat and was out the door before Gareth had finished explaining, running toward the lower fields with her heart hammering in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. The scene she found there was chaos in the practical, unglamorous way real emergencies usually are, water rising steadily across the low ground. Families hauling what belongings they could carry toward higher ground, livestock being driven up the slope with more noise than order, and in the middle of it, sleeves rolled up despite the winter chill, was Julian, directing the effort with the same calm urgency she remembered from the night of her own family's fire. He saw her before she reached him, and something in his face opened, unguarded, relieved, entirely without the careful composure a duke was supposed to wear in front of his people. "Alina, tell me what needs doing," she said, already moving toward the nearest cottage, and for the next several hours there was no time for anything but the work in front of them, side by side, hauling belongings and herding frightened animals, and helping an elderly tenant woman up the muddy slope with careful, steady hands, the two of them falling into a rhythm of shared effort that felt, in its own strange way, more intimate than any conversation could have managed. By the time the water was contained, the light was fading fast, and every family along the lower row stood safe on higher ground, cold and tired and grateful, and Julian and Alina found themselves standing apart from the rest of the crowd, both soaked through, both too exhausted to keep pretending the moment was only about the flood. "You came," Julian said. "You needed help," Alina said. "I wasn't going to let pride keep me from a flooded field, even if it kept me from you for 3 months." "I would have come to you," Julian said. "I wanted to, every single day. I stayed away because you asked me to prove the choice was whole first, and I didn't want to hand you half a promise dressed up as a finished one. Was it worth it, 3 months of proving it? I renegotiated every tenant lease on this estate. I sold a lodge I never used. I learned more about running this land in 3 months than my father learned in 30 years of owning it," Julian said. "But none of that is what I actually wanted to tell you. What I wanted to tell you is that I thought about you every morning I woke up, and every night before I slept, and somewhere in the middle of trying to become a man worth trusting, I realized I had already fully, completely chosen you, long before I ever finished any of the paperwork that made it official to everyone else." Elena's breath caught, and for once she did not have a sharp answer ready, only the plain, unguarded truth she had been carrying since a gold-lit morning by a river months earlier. "I love you," she said. "I have since that very first morning when you didn't tell me who you were and I got to fall for the man underneath the title instead. I was just too frightened for a long while to say it without a reason to be afraid of it." "Are you still afraid?" "A little," Elena admitted. "But I've decided I'd rather be a little afraid and standing next to you than perfectly safe and standing alone." Julian closed the last of the distance between them, and this time neither of them stepped back. The kiss that followed was unhurried despite the cold, despite the mud and the exhaustion and the small crowd of tenants still gathering their animals a short distance away, none of whom seemed particularly surprised by what they were witnessing, several of whom had, in fact, been quietly expecting it for months. They were married the following spring, not in the grand cathedral in the county town, where the ward wedding would have taken place, but in the small stone church in the village, with tenants and farmers and shopkeepers filling the pews instead of titled families from across the region. Constance sent a letter of congratulations that arrived a week before the ceremony, gracious and warm in a way that told Julian she had, in her own time, found her peace with how things had unfolded. On the morning of the wedding, before the ceremony, before the crowds and the vows and the long day of celebration ahead, Julian rose early and rode out alone to the river, the same stretch of water where all of it had begun. The mist was rising gold off the surface exactly as it had that first morning, and for a long moment he simply stood there, remembering the sound of a laugh that had changed the whole direction of his life. Elena found him there an hour later, having guessed exactly where he would be, and she did not ask why he had come. She only walked down to stand beside him at the water's edge, her wedding dress still hours away, her hair still loose around her shoulders the way it had been that very first morning she had fallen into the river and laughed about it. "You know where the river is," she said, echoing herself one final time, and Julian laughed, properly freely, the way he had never once laughed inside the walls of his own house, and took her hand, and together they watched the sun finish rising over the water that had given them, against every rule either of their worlds had tried to place between them, exactly the life they had both been too afraid to ask for,